American writer Nancy Folbray sets out a playful fable. Some goddesses devise a competition amongst nations, a kind of Olympics with a twist. Health and prosperity for all will be the prize granted to the nation that can collectively run the greatest distance in the shortest time. The first nation divides caring and running according to gender. Men run on ahead hard and fast in exchange for being in charge, while women come along behind them looking after the children, the sick and the elderly, as well as those who are injured in the race. They give birth to new runners to replace those exhausted. At first, all goes well for this nation. Over time, however, women began to see that rewards given to men for running far outweigh those bestowed on the carers. They know that they too could run just as hard and fast as the men, and they demand equal rights. When the men resist, the women go out on strike, causing chaos. This nation is set to lose the race. The second nation, the chief reason my point, the second nation sees the pitfalls of excluding women from the race, and it assumes that the race is not going to last a long time, so it sets its members to compete every person for themselves. Some citizens at first speed quickly away, but as the race goes on, many begin to fall by the wayside. There are fewer non-competitors, or none in the end, to care for the sick and the injured. Female runners have no time to give birth. Fertility drops sharply, and this nation can no longer reproduce itself. Before long, it becomes clear that this nation too will lose the race. All eyes now turn to the third nation. Like the canny tortoise against the hare, it's making slow and steady progress. Everyone is required to both run and take care of those who cannot run. Care is as valued as running. The strategy is less efficient short term, but as the long race wears on, it is revealed to have great strengths. While the first two nations have by now collapsed, the citizens from the third nation grow strong as well as fast, while their freedom and equality foster their solidarity. Folbray, the author of this fable, ends mischievously. She says, "Of course this nation won the race. What did you expect? It was a race that goddesses designed." She's making a serious point. In the first story, the society is the older traditional world where men worked and women stayed at home. That's the world we are in the process of leaving behind. Folbray is honest enough, though, which I think is a rarity in a feminist author, to acknowledge that while this state of affairs was hardly just for women, it did reliably provide care for dependents. The second society, every person for themselves, where everybody is expected to work and be a breadwinner, is, in her view, a description of our own society, the United States. It's an extreme version of a contemporary neoliberal or free market society. In that society, mothers as well as fathers are expected to work, and it took 11 years of political struggle to get just 3 months of unpaid family leave. The childcare quality, although there'll be some really excellent centres, the childcare quality overall is poor. One very good study found that only about 9% was of high enough quality to be considered non-damaging to children. So in that society there's a care deficit, and there's a care penalty in terms of income foregone, as well as respect in the world for those who cut back at work or who leave work altogether to care for family members. A third society where work and care is equitably shared is much closer to Scandinavian nations like Sweden or Norway, where typically they have much longer periods of paid leave when a child is born. They also invest much more in high-quality childcare. Swedish parents now receive around a total of 480 days of leave per child, 390 days of which is paid at 80% of salary. In all measures of well-being, in the US, mothers and children do worse than in Scandinavia. The rate of poverty, for example, is much higher. According to OECD figures from 2013, about 80% of Swedish mothers also work. So you have very high work rates, comparable to that in the United States. So it is actually a way of achieving high levels of female work participation, but in a very different kind of way to the US. The Sydney Morning Herald recently reported an Australian father who was living in Sweden, and he really couldn't believe going there and the kind of regime they had for child rearing. He'd taken 6 months leave himself, and part of the leave in Sweden is actually reserved for fathers on a use it or lose it basis. It's trying to change the norms around child rearing away from only women doing it. He was also paying about $250 a month for very high quality childcare when the child finally, at around 18 months, went back into childcare. And between the two of them, they could both cut back 25% of their working day, working week, so they could have 1 day at home. Of course, obviously at less pay. And across Europe, not only in the generous Swedish regime, you're much more likely to have this period of early childhood with some kind of paid leave and with the first 3 years essentially protected, even in places like Slovakia, and certainly in places like Austria, and as well as the Scandinavian nations. And in Britain too, they have longer paid leave than Australia, and so too they do in Canada. Not as generous as through most of Europe. So in Australia we're somewhere in between, much closer to the United States than Scandinavia. Or to put it another way, the kind of transformation that Folbro is hoping for, where care and work is both shared and highly valued, is only half born here. And the consequence is that parents, and especially mothers, often find themselves stretched across two domains, stressed and at times confronted with insoluble dilemmas over work and care. We often attribute this to the unintended consequence of the feminist revolution or of women's choices, and we assume that the changes are coming from the grassroots. I think that's only part of the story. Another part is that a lot of the changes are being now encouraged from above. In fact, there is a new paradigm, a real paradigm shift across Western nations. In the OECD, the European Union, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, if you look at any of the kind of documents which touch on these areas, whether it's about childcare, and I've actually recently, even at the World Bank, got very interested in early childcare as an economic investment, this new paradigm is evident. One scholar, an American sociologist, Anne Orloff, has put a name to it, and she calls it the farewell to maternalism. That is because the new mantra, the new idea in both national and international bodies is seeing economic advantages to increasing women's workforce participation. So we are shifting to post-maternalist policies. In simple terms, that will mean not commitment to something like the baby bonus for stay-at-home parents, but it will mean at least some form of parental leave, and particularly investment in childcare. You'll have a move away from pensions for sole parents and encouragement for them to go into the workforce. Those measures have gone much further in the US than here, but already we are obviously playing around with them. The title of one OECD report captures the mood. It's called Putting More Women to Work. In an insecure labour market, they're quite explicit. Women's work will act as a kind of hedge fund against their partner's potential unemployment. So the new economy is a high-risk one with a lot of insecurity in the labour market. And so to have two parents working is seen as a security for a family, and also means that more income is coming through to people and wages can be driven down. The new expectation now, across all of these documents, is that women will be granted brief leaves of absence around childbirth, for example, and short periods of carer's leave if someone's very sick in the family. An elderly parent has a stroke, something like that. But they will be expected to engage in lifelong, as close to full-time work as possible. They must work, but there's also, in these documents, the assumption that they will continue to provide, organise household and familial care. And that's where I begin to get worried. Because while this seems as if it is going along with the great thrust of the women's movement. In fact, the expectation that women will, as well as men, work, but also to continue to provide most of the care, to me sounds more like the road to exhaustion than emancipation. And that last aspect gives an important clue to how to judge this new paradigm, what I call the get to work paradigm. I say use that title, Putting Women to Work. Get to Work is the title of a book that came out in the US. There's something coercive about it. So something quite precious to do with choice, autonomy, and the ways in which we govern our lives around these very intimate family matters of when you go back, when you cease breastfeeding, all of those kinds of things are starting to enter a state ideology. The key issue is actually demographics. It's about fertility falling below replacement level. For that you need 2 children per woman per lifetime, and all around the world fertility is falling. Books are coming out called The Grey Dawn or The Demographic Winter. There's lots of writing on this subject. And the real anxiety is that as fewer children are born, the next generation of the working age population is shrinking, while the people their taxes support, now the elderly, is actually growing. It's much larger. So in Australia we're going to have fewer people supporting the large baby boomer cohort as they become elderly. So this preoccupation with the new paradigm of women going to work is about demographics and it's about economics. And we've already seen some of the first salvos in this argument with the preoccupation now of getting young mothers back to work and also people up to the age of 70, which I'm sure you've all heard in the news, keeping at work. And essentially it is this bottom line that is operating. The push has occurred under Conservative as well as progressive parties. It happened under John Howard. There was a lot of rhetoric at the time that he was all about stay-at-home mothers and he was all about conservative family life and so on. In fact, he did hold the line a little bit on choice, but in fact he always continued, under his government there was a continuation of increase of funding to getting women back to work. And in the next generation of Liberal Party people like Joe Hockey and Tony Abbott, it has now moved into the domain of really considering seriously paid parental leave. One of the headlines in 2005 screamed, Costello, get mums working. Under Rudd and Gillard's Labor, there was one which said, Treasury gets tough on bludgeoning soccer mums. That was in the Daily Telegraph, speaking about the mothers who had school-aged children and how they had to get back to work. It was reporting the Treasury Secretary, well then Treasury, Ken Henry, who was giving an argument to a conference about tax, and he was saying, this is one of the things we have to do. So, despite our rhetoric about women and choice, families and choice, it's a bit like Henry Ford's quip about the early Fords coming off his production line. You can have any colour you want so long as it's black. You can have any, it's going to be, you can have any choice you want so long as it's work. So why does it matter? Given that so many women really do want to work, given that gender equity brings all sorts of advantages for both men and women, given that women participating fully in the workforce is a matter of justice. It matters because those deeply important ideas of justice, ideals of justice, are being distorted by a society that is also a neoliberal society that is actually cutting or in the process of trying to engage in really stringent fiscal restraint and discipline. So what that means is the money that needs to assist this huge transformation of women going into the workforce, everything from nursing home care to people going into ordinary homes to support the elderly, to childcare, to paid parental leave, is on a shoestring budget. Before you even begin to settle those questions, you are dealing with less resources in a low taxing regime, because we have in Australia one of the lowest taxing regimes amongst all OECD nations. You would never know that from the rhetoric from the politicians. You think we are being taxed very highly, but in fact that isn't the case. So we also have every election, politicians, they have lined up for, well, really since Howard in 1996, offering like Santa Claus tax cuts every election, which again has meant a huge amount of money which has gone into people's, particularly the top end of taxation, the higher income earners, but it hasn't gone into the collective pool in order to be able to fund these kinds of things. Furthermore, there's the idea that we need to deregulate the labour market. That is, you need to have private enterprise bargaining, you need to have a circumstance where the business can be efficient, where trade union power has been markedly reduced. And in reality, if you look at the, Nancy Folbray's The Race of Goddesses, that third society where you were organising work and care, and then the reality of somewhere like Sweden or somewhere in Europe, you actually need a kind of re-regulation of the labour market. You need to bring in quite different kinds of policies. And we're doing that to some extent, but there's a lot of ambivalence about it. So you have, on the one hand, let's take the notion of flexibility. Flexibility can mean two different things depending on your perspective as to whether you are an employer or whether you're an employee with family responsibilities. Flexibility from one point of view might mean that people are coming at the times that suit your work, they are on call, whereas from a point of view of the person who has family responsibilities, they probably need a very settled regime of knowing, for example, when they're going to be called into employment and whether they can have childcare on that particular day. So they're in tension. I don't think that it can never be resolved, but it's certainly in tension. And the other aspect about society, I think that work itself has become a new kind of sacred. There's a kind of enchanted value to it. I think Hugh Mackay, the commentator, caught this very well when he said, there's a new way we greet each other, and we don't say, how are you? We say, how are you busy? And so there's this sense, a kind of hierarchy of time. And the people who are really busy are those who are in the top professions and who earn a lot of money, and they do not have time in their hands. Whereas people who are lower down the economic scale, but particularly those who do care, have a lot of time in their hands, and indeed the very nature of care requires a great deal of time. So I think the message of going to work can be confused with feminism. That is, the two sometimes can work together, but they are often in tension and in conflict. And it can easily obscure that anyone with care responsibilities, it can just end up as a counterfeit of what is wanted. It doesn't, for example, if you have this ideal, if you have a new sacred of work, it doesn't challenge very extreme worker norms which still govern many of the elite professions, so that female doctors who've done extremely well in surgery training, for example, and who would dearly love to take it on, but they also want to have children and want to spend time with them, say there has been very little movement in the medical profession to allow that to occur. So they will go to be a GP, which is, it's very fine to have wonderful GPs, but it isn't right that we are not even properly looking at that. Young academics tell me that they're told by older female professors they should write quite a lot of articles before they have a child, put it in a drawer, and then send them out so that you actually conceal the fact that you've taken a little bit of time out. Whereas the other way of looking at it is actually the way that David Morrison has started speaking in the army, where he said, I actually want to promote women when they come back from leave because I want to represent and recognise the skills they develop while they're parenting. And men, of course, would also develop those skills. So this Get to Work program doesn't challenge this ideal worker model and doesn't show the creative and very different forms of work that we can establish, which both allows for greater gender equity but also carries the interests of those who are being cared for. And in reality, say in law, many young women who go into law tell me that they watch the older female partners and often the hours that they work, they feel that they have a choice, and the choice is no choice at all. The choice is to not see your family, or alternatively, to step out of the workforce altogether. So these immensely talented workers and they're looking at how those in front of them have had to do it. Of course, there are exceptions, but we should not be looking to build for interest and justice a world made of exceptions. We need to have something where people can find a place much more easily. But the other problem, I think, comes to what Michael Sandel was saying in his book, What Money Can't Buy, The Moral Limits of Markets. It's an extremely good book, and it's funny, it's really something I've been trying to articulate in my writing since I started in the mid-90s. And he says, without quite realising it, we've drifted from having a market society to being a market society. Having a market society is a tool, an economy is a tool, it's a valuable tool for organising productive activity. A market society is a way of life in which market values seep into every aspect of human endeavour. It's a place where social relations have been made over into the image of the market. And he says markets don't only allocate goods and services, they actually express and promote certain attitudes towards the goods being exchanged. An example of that is Ken Henry's review, the Treasury review I spoke of earlier, when he was talking about the bludgeoning, or the headline said, caught what he was saying, and talked about bludgeoning soccer mums. He said, Treasury has as its goal supporting a society that allows individuals to lead lives of value. And he was speaking about those women and the care work that they were doing. And he was saying that what they're doing is antithetical to leading a life of value. So for me, this is hugely problematic because it's not just to do with the traditional gender role there. We need to, just as Michael Sandel points out, carry with the new world all the values which were embedded in our appreciation of those activities which are outside the market, like care. It's something precious, it's something infinite, it's something that we all absolutely depend upon. So this danger in this society is not only all the things that I've outlined, but actually there's a deeper layer of meaning which can be made problematic. That attitude to care is caught in a 65-year-old man who said that he was looking after his mother, he was shopping, he was visiting, he was caring for her, he was doing all the various things. But he says, it makes me feel I've failed as a man. And it seems to me that there's tremendous pressure on men still to be successful in the labour market. That's how we judge them. And increasingly we judge women that way too. So what I would say, that to go back to that fable, that the third society where you value both, you would not have people being shamefaced and embarrassed. Often when I speak, people come up to me afterwards and say, I'm so relieved you mentioned care in a respectful way because I happen to be caring for my child who is completely dependent. They're an adult, but they have a mental illness. And I've had to go out of the workforce. I had a very good position, but I've done this. And yet I'm now invisible. Someone else will say, actually, I volunteer all the time, and yet I feel as if I am not a person of value. So what I'm saying is, as we enter a new kind of world, we need to be carrying these values with us. The market thinking, too, can do another form of dehumanisation. And let me give you an example. There's surely few human bonds which are as close and as intimate physically and emotionally as a mother breastfeeding her baby. But in the US, there's a portrait by a writer, Jill Leopold, of women waiting in line for their turn at an electric outlet for breast pumps. She says, and now I'm quoting, duck into the ladies' room at a conference of, say, professors, and chances are you'll find a flock of women with matching briefcases, apparently made like a Gucci backpack, waiting none too patiently and, trust me, more than a little sheepishly, for a turn at the electric outlet. Pumps come with plastic sleeves, like the sleeves in a man's wallet, into which the mother is supposed to slip a photograph of her baby, because Pavlov-like, looking at the picture aids letdown of the milk, the release of milk normally triggered by the presence of the baby. It's touch, it's crime. And so there's an element of the assembly line here. There's an element of industrialising the breast. And apparently, I didn't realise this, just to carry that point a little further, just like a bull semen, you can now purchase online in the US a mother's colostrum, which is a substance which comes in, is incredibly nutritious just after birth for the baby. It gives the baby immune protection. It is astonishing what is in these clear drops of colostrum just before the milk comes in. And it's sold over the internet under enticing titles like "Buy one and get one free." So one answer to those kinds of dilemmas, which I am quite quickly sketching, which preserves the intimacy, the closeness, for example, of the breastfeeding relationship, which does not sacrifice women's long-term attachment to the labour force, is parental leave. And overseas, these policies have been incredibly successful. British childcare expert Ed Mellowish observed that unless you compromise on quality, the cost of subsidising childcare for the under-twos is broadly comparable to generous parental leave. And in Sweden, this is what he said, the Swedish case is very revealing. There was high-quality infant care available to all and heavily subsidised. It was widely used in the 70s and 80s, but in the early 90s, parental leave was increased, and there's now remarkably little use of childcare under 18 months. After that, they do go into childcare, very good childcare. Parents voted, he says, with their feet. Which then brings me to Tony Abbott's recent parental leave scheme. This is a very strange hybrid beast. It's half Swedish, which is astonishing in neoliberal Australia, and it's half neoliberal. What I call a neoliberal wolf camouflaged in sheep's clothing, feminist clothing. And the problem is that if you look at it, it is really oriented to maintaining women's attachment to the labour force, which I have no objection to, but with this very brief release of time. So you must understand that parental leave policies came into Scandinavia and had several components. And one of these is an extremely important one that in Australia I feel has been skipped over. It wasn't just baby leave. It wasn't just about childbirth and then the mother gets back. It was actually trying to enshrine and carry forward into the new world the value of child well-being. So parental leave was seen as a child's right, which is a different way of looking at it. And we talk very glibly and quickly about something called bonding, which kind of seems to be over quickly. You know, in reality, they're talking about very serious processes of attachment, which take the whole first year, which are invaluable to a child. To have a secure attachment is like one specialist called it an internal pot of gold. You know, it gives them all kinds of emotional benefits and security, confidence, and so on. So these are serious matters for children as well as for adults. And while none of the Scandinavian systems ever prevent, in fact they support completely with high quality childcare, someone going back quite early if they should wish it, as indeed they should, it is actually possible for people who are less well off, for example, than someone who can hire a nanny at 6 weeks or even earlier. It helps those who are at the lower end of the economy, and it protects them. And I'll just finish on one final note, which is that this is a question, will parental leave bring equality? In reality, it is wonderful, as wonderful it is that we are having a conversation about parental leave. It completely obscures that for children, there is at least 18 years of raising them, where you need all sorts of things from workplace flexibility, e-commuting. You need a raft of things so that it can't just be, there's been an excessive concentration on the first kind of few months or half year of a child's life when it's much larger than that. But care actually goes much deeper than that, because the very parents who are struggling over managing work and family now, Anna, will, before long, in another decade or two, believe me, because I'm there now, will manage a new, similar kind of crisis, judging from my own experience and my friends, and that is elder care, where suddenly the frail parent becomes seriously frail. There's a fall, there's a stroke, there's dementia, there's all kinds of, all of a sudden, If the early ones are around a crisis of reproduction, this is a crisis of old age where you need to swing your attention fully and properly to that old person and honour what it takes to care for them. You may well get assistance from all sorts of quarters, but nonetheless it needs to be done. And so the parental leave is an immensely important plank of social policy. We cannot go forward into any kind of equal or just society without it, but it is entirely misleading to think that it will alone produce a society where we are able to care for one another in the way that most of us would like.